morning, everyone. Welcome to I Encuentro RELIF. We are honored and glad to present Dr. Cedric Boeckx from Catalan Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Barcelona. Dr. Boeckx is a prominent linguist who has written widely on syntax, minimalism, and the biological foundations of the human language faculty. He's the author of numerous books, including Elementary Syntactic Structures, Syntactic Islands, Language in Cognition, Bare Syntax, and the editor of numerous volumes. His current projects are all intended to facilitate integration among disciplines such as linguistics, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, genetics, and archaeology, and lead to better experimental testing of theoretical hypotheses as well as to more solid interpretations of experimental findings. Thank you, Professor Boeckx, for giving us your insights about linguistics. So our first question is, what advice would you give to someone who is starting out on linguistic research?
First of all, thank you very much for your invitation, for having me, for asking those questions. The first question is great. So the advice for young people trying to get into the field of linguistics cannot be answered, I think, in a very concise fashion and in a unique fashion for everybody. I think linguistics is many things to many different people, and young researchers will come to linguistics with different backgrounds, different interests, and so it's very hard to provide an answer that will satisfy everyone. I think that from my experience, many students come to linguistics through their interests, their love, their passion for different languages, for learning different languages, for speaking different languages, right? That's not how I came to linguistics. I came through it via an interest in philosophy and how I got to know about Noam Chomsky's work, for example, primarily in philosophy and then in linguistics. I know different people came through linguistics through mathematics or more formal sciences. And I think that these different groups of individuals coming to linguistics through different experiences are in a way the thing that enriches the field most. I mean, it's something we should cultivate. We should really ask for this sort of diversity that students bring in to the discipline. And the discipline really is there for all these interests. That is, there are many different ways of doing linguistics. I happen to be particularly interested in a set of questions that I think go back to people like Noam Chomsky or Eric Lennerberg on the biological foundations of language. That doesn't exhaust in any way what linguistics means. The notion, the concept of language is so rich that different people can really make a contribution to linguistics regardless of the diversity of their interests. I think that for a young linguist right now, I can see also difficulties in joining a field like linguistics. It is the case that you know, when people join a field, maybe they have an interest in staying in that field for many years, right? Maybe developing an academic career in linguistics. And there, I think there are quite a few challenges for young researchers in terms of job availability. I mean, it is the case that linguistics is changing. It's clear that no matter what your interests are, the future will require a combination of interest in language with things you can derive from other disciplines. And I think if there were bits and pieces of advice I could give to students would be, first, of course, cultivate your passion and interest in language. So whatever the reason may be for why people decided to go into linguistics, they should always try to remember that, because in situations of doubt, of difficulties, I think it's always useful to remember why people got into a field in the first place. But in addition to this, I would advise young linguists to try to read widely. That is, try to learn from as many disciplines as possible. Try to find those disciplines that are adjacent to linguistics, so close to linguistics, that would really help you, whoever that may be, enrich the sort of questions that you want to ask. And I think that although linguistics is a very broad field, it is, in my view, stronger when it takes advantage from the things one can derive from other disciplines that are right next to it. There are very obvious cases, like I already mentioned philosophy. Maybe computer science is also an interesting discipline. Biology for me is an essential discipline. Anthropology, archaeology, all these disciplines that of course will be somewhat different for everyone based on their interests, but I think each and every one of them will help, I think, add perspectives, add knowledge, add questions to essentially the drive that comes from everyone and their passion. So I think that if linguists, young linguists, can take classes in other domains, so much the better. I had I think, relatively traditional education in linguistics, at least in my PhD studies, where, you know, people took classes in different areas of linguistics. And if I had to change things, if I could change things, I would say that take more classes outside of linguistics to enrich your experience, to diversify your perspectives, your opinions, and simply to learn tools that would be very beneficial when applied to the domain of language. And maybe people haven't thought of applying those tools yet to language, and that's an opportunity for young linguists to do so.
Yes, I think I couldn't agree more, because not only is linguistic an interdisciplinary field where people from different disciplines can work together, but also I think we must work interdisciplinary. We must get study from different areas, and maybe when you are starting, this is really difficult, because maybe you have to go to another university, another faculty, and say, okay, I'm going to take a course on statistics, and I don't know anything about this, but maybe it's scary at first, but I think what you say is the key. We must push, and we have to get different information from different fields, so we can work and think better questions and think new answers for all questions. And I think maybe that's the key of biolinguistics, no? Like,
if I may just add to something you said, yes, it's difficult, challenging, maybe a bit scary to go outside of one's discipline, but I think that it's I think it's easier to do it at a very early stage than at a later stage, because once people grow up in a particular discipline, it's very hard to, you accumulate a certain background, you accumulate a certain set of assumptions that to some extent make your view, your perspective narrower. And it's very hard to correct this afterwards. It's not impossible, but it's hard. It's just like a set of habits that everyone acquires, and getting rid of habits can be very hard. I think at the beginning, when people join a new field, they don't have those sets of habits that are deeply ingrained. And so it's maybe the best time to try to branch out immediately, because very often students tell me, When I encourage them, for example, to look at genetics or archaeology or whatever it may be, people say, yeah, but I'm not a biologist, I'm not an archaeologist. And I understand that statement. I understand the feeling behind it. But on the other hand, young linguists are also not, if you allow me, linguists yet. And yet they don't feel so scared. That is, you rarely hear them say, but I'm not a linguist, when they go and take classes in linguistics, right? Even though to a certain extent, they are not yet formed as linguists. So why should they be scared to go into another discipline when they are not yet really part of one discipline to begin with? I think it's an opportunity for them to say, yeah, look, I'm taking classes in linguistics, for example, even though I'm not a linguist, I'm hoping to become one. They should approach the other disciplines with exactly the same attitude. Yes, they are not philosophers, they are not biologists, they are not whatever, but that doesn't mean that they cannot become part of those fields as well, or create one at the intersection between fields. I think it's, even though it's scary, I understand that, it's much harder to do it 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, when you have adopted a perspective that limits your field of vision. So I think that it's important to bear that in mind, that the fear of moving into another discipline is present. I know that, but I think that it can be overcome if you realize the benefits that you can reap from such a move. I think that the benefits really are huge, and the difficulty will pay off in the end, I think, for everyone who takes that step.
Yes, well, I think that's a great advice for young linguists and also for young research, like almost everywhere. And moving on to our next questions, which are the great milestones in the discipline in the last 20 years? Or which do you think are the great milestones?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, in the sense that, when you say the great milestones in the discipline, I assume you mean the discipline of linguistics, right? But I don't think linguistics is a discipline. I think it's many different disciplines. And depending on how you view linguistics, you will pick different great milestones. So I'll give you mine, right? But when I do so, I hope it's not misunderstood as, those are the only ones. Those were, in a certain sense, the milestones for me. Those works that I go back to. I think that there are a couple that come to my mind immediately. I mean, the first one is still, to me, Chomsky's Syntactic Structures in 1957. It's a book that I think is not read very much. It's a book that, it's one of those, it's a classic that is, people know about it without reading it, right? But I think that it's still an interesting book that captures an important moment in linguistics, when linguistics was trying to become part of cognitive sciences, right? And it's a book that cannot be read on its own. I think that if people try to read syntactic structures nowadays, it's very hard to understand the book as such. You require a lot of background that aren't in the book, but I think it's part of the experience of reading syntactic structures. So I think that Chomsky's 59 review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, helps understand syntactic structure. Chapter 1 of Chomsky's Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, published in 65, was written actually around that same period in the late 50s. I think the collaboration between Chomsky and Eric Lenneberg around that period very clear in Chomsky's review of Skinner's book, is very important to understand syntactic structures. I think that the bit that I like the most in syntactic structures, I think it's one thing that comes up certainly at the very beginning of the book, maybe the first or second pages, when Chomsky points out that the analysis that he presents, even though it's based on English, he envisages an analysis of language, of linguistic structures, that doesn't make reference to a specific language or to specific languages, where, you know, it's clear there that the ambition is one that seeks to understand the language faculty, irrespective of the specific languages that are the products of this ability to acquire language. And that's essentially a move that takes linguistics on a certain path, which is the path of biological foundations of language. It's the path to cognition, and then from cognition to biology. And that remains, to me, a certain milestone. I think that the analysis that Chomsky proposes in syntactic structures, but also in a paper in 1956 called Three Models of Language Description or something like that, really remains a central result in the field, where Chomsky actually provides a way of characterizing linguistic structures according to, as it were, a complexity scale that's sometimes called the Chomsky hierarchy, right? That's unfortunately something that's not taught much these days in linguistics. I mean, it's seen as an old-fashioned kind of approach to language, although it's one that I think is one of the few things that many linguistic traditions, theoretical traditions, actually agree upon implicitly. I think it was Ed Stabler, linguist at UCLA, who stressed this remarkable fact that there is actually a consensus in the field. So for young linguists who don't know this, they will soon they'll soon discover that linguistics is a very fragmented field, where you know, it's not like people understand language in many different ways and do different things. Even when they agree on certain questions, they are very they have very strong feelings about how to answer these questions, right? And the field has been dominated by figure that's very polarizing, right? So none of this helped, really. So it's very hard to find things that many linguists kind of agree upon, implicitly or explicitly. But that early result in syntactic structures is maybe one of the few things that linguists implicitly agree upon. So I certainly put that as a milestone. Another milestone for me, again, would be Eric Lenneberg's work on, you know, collected in his 1967 book, Biological Foundations of Language, where, you know, you have very important notions like the critical period, an early interest in language evolution, an interest in the brain, an interest in development, seeing language acquisition as a process. I think that's a very important perspective, and I think it's one that, again, not many linguists appreciate to a full extent. So it's also very common to hear that Lenneberg's work is outdated. I mean, it's 1967. It's you know, it's not the past 10 years, and of course there are many things that are outdated in the book, but I think the perspective there is perhaps even more important, at least to me, than anything written by linguists of the traditional sort. I think that if you were to ask me the sort of book that deserves an update, but also that deserves the status of a classic, of a reference one, Lennerberg's book would certainly be the one that I would put number one on the list. Other milestones, there are really very many that one can think of. Maybe more recent ones, I would say the attention in neurolinguistics, where people have taken inspiration, for example, from the field of vision science, and distinguished between a ventral track and a dorsal track linking, say, the prefrontal cortex and the temporal cortex, would be one of the milestones. I'm thinking here of the work of Greg Hickok and Dave Puppel. I think that that's certainly an important aspect of what we understand now about language in general. Our appreciation that the classic model, Broca-Wernicke, captures some important truth about the organization of language in the brain, but is also severely limited and needs to be extended to many different areas of the brain. I think that that's a lesson that we've come to learn that I think is very important. There's also, I think, an important, more recent development in the field that I think is an important milestone as well, which is this understanding that non-linguistic creatures, that is pretty much every other species except us, can actually tell you a lot about language. If you're willing to drop many human-centric assumptions about language, other species can actually help you reveal some workings of language. You know, I'm old enough to remember teaching very early in my career, teaching from a book by Steve Anderson called Dr. Doolittle's Delusion, where the book basically says, look, other species, they are cool, they tell you interesting things about communication, but about language, really not much, right? It's all, it's very different from what you find in human language, and look how great human language is. And I think that this book, published maybe around the year 2001, 2 or so, it has become so outdated in the past 20 years that all the works that have made this book outdated is part of a milestone in the field. I think it's of showing that non-linguistic creatures are actually, as it were, partially linguistic creatures, and they can actually inform you about what it is that makes us human, what it is that makes us you know, linguistic creatures in the maybe the fullest sense of the terms. And I think I would also add this to the milestone. That's from my own perspectives. I think that there's massive work where that deserves the status of milestone in, say, sociolinguistics, in fields like pragmatics, in areas that I myself have not worked on, but I think are just as important as the discipline that maybe I represented for a while through my work. That's for other people to actually judge, because my perspective may not be as central, say, as when it comes to the theoretical part of linguistics that I'm most familiar with. But for that, I think, and maybe for young linguists, it's interesting to remember that even very old work can actually be extremely relevant. That the works that you know, make a difference really do take time to make that difference, so that the work that comes out that you can find maybe in the past 5 years or so may very well become milestones in the future. But we shouldn't forget that linguistics is actually a very old field with important findings going way back. So I limited my attention in this answer to basically you know, the beginning of, say, Chomsky linguistics. That's the part that I know best. Lots of different results in linguistics, maybe when the thing was not even called linguistics, thing ought to be studied and appreciated, right? And so maybe to go back to the first question, advice to young linguists, um, uh, try to be knowledgeable about the history of the field as much as you can. You don't have to be a professional historian, but I think it's important to appreciate that that the field has a certain history, went through different stages, and these stages mattered. They helped us build our knowledge that we currently have. But I think it's a mistake to just read the latest thing, as exciting as the latest thing sounds.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. And I would like to comment on one of the milestones you mentioned. You said that in the last 2 decades, maybe there was a shift and we start thinking of the possibility for other species not to have language as a whole, but certain parts of language. So can you comment on that? I mean, that line of thought has, how does that line of thought contributed to our better understanding of the human faculty of language?
Well, I think the look, if you were to open you know, maybe the best known works of Charles Darwin in biology, say The Origin of Species or The Descent of Man, both these books open with the notion of comparison. I think that in biology, the notion, the act of comparing species, individuals, whatever, is really essential. The comparative method is central to evolutionary biology. Right? And it seemed to me that if you claim, like linguists, well, at least some linguists do, that there is something biological about our language instinct, if you want, then you ought to approach language the way biologists do. And in particular, since evolution is so central to our understanding of biology, we ought to approach it like an evolutionary biologist would, namely by carefully comparing species. And there, I think it's important to drop the tendency of linguists to not compare but contrast. That is, linguists are fond of saying, but look, those species, whatever those are, whatever they have as a communication system, it's unlike human language, right? And so they pick those traits of language that make human language special, instead of insisting that in many ways the communication systems that you find across species is really in line with, continuous with human language. Maybe the best domain where this has been clearly demonstrated and the value of it is now very obvious is the field of vocal learning, which is this ability that we have to essentially imitate the vocal patterns of conspecifics. That's something that's essential to a human speech, but it's also found in actually a growing number of species. But perhaps the most immediate species people think of, or set of species, is the parrots or the songbirds, or maybe the hummingbirds, but also the bats now, the seals, and so on and so forth. And there, I think, we can see the true value of comparative work, where for ethical reasons, there are many experiments that one cannot do with humans. And these experiments are possible in a range of species. and they allow us to basically come up with very precise answers that wouldn't be possible if we restricted our attention to humans, right? And all of these answers become relevant once you adopt a comparative perspective where you say, look, what we have can also be found, say, in songbirds, in the case of vocal learning. Now, no one's confused in saying that songbirds have human language. They don't, right? But they clearly have a trait that's analogous, or in fact homologous, with a trait that we find in human language. And this has essentially this success of the work on vocal learning in other species at various levels: neurological, genetic, behavioral, developmental. At all these levels, this success has made it possible for researchers to come to appreciate that it's not just vocal learning. Maybe we can recognize many other components of language in other species, some distant, some closely related species. That, in a certain sense, matters less, as long as we recognize that expanding the database is of species relevant for the study of language is just great. I think that linguists often say that it will never run out of languages to study, and I think that it's correct. But they should realize that in addition to all the great languages that one could study, there are also lots of different systems that are offered by other species that could be studied in the context of human language. That is, that could be studied and count as relevant for our understanding of language. And that, I think, has been a dramatic shift of the past 20 years or so, where people have come to appreciate that this contrastive stance, it's us versus the rest, is not very productive. Maybe it was productive for a while, but I think it ceased to be productive. And that's a remarkable finding, because instead of just being able to look at one species, us, we can look at many more. And I think that who wouldn't like that, right? It's the source of many projects. Instead of just having one species to look at, it's many, and it's just great. So empirically speaking, it makes the field much richer.
Yes, and related to that question and your answer, what other challenges do you think we are facing in the area nowadays?
Many, many challenges. I think that, again, my answer will be limited in part by my own perspective, but I can detect quite a few challenges. The first one is thinking of the field I used to contribute to, theoretical linguistics. It is the case that the perspective that has dominated for 60, almost 70 years now, is not going through its best period. So I'm here referring to, what people might call transformational generative grammar or Chomsky linguistics. For various reasons, I think that portion of the field is not going through a very productive period. Certainly, if you compare it to, say, the boost that it got in the 1980s with the comparison with cross-linguistic comparisons, or even the early days of the minimalist program. The minimalist program is perhaps, in Chomsky linguistics, the latest in the field. But it goes back to 1993 as a program. And if you call something a program after 25 years, maybe it's not a program anymore, right? And I think that there's really an important challenge, or set of challenges that arise from this. I think that I don't think that, let me put it this way. If I were a young linguist starting now, knowing a little bit what I know, so of course I'm cheating a bit, right? But knowing a little bit what I know, I'm not sure that I would enter the field of theoretical linguistics today. It's just not a very productive area anymore. So that's one challenge for those people who are passionate about this, and I can certainly understand that passion. I share that passion for many years, but there's a question there. Another set of challenges is the one that we started off with, namely the notion of interdisciplinarity. Right? It sounds great, saying that we can take advantage of many tools, many knowledge bases, many findings from other disciplines. That's fantastic, right? That is the thing that keeps me excited and going every day. But at the same time, you know, it requires you to develop some skills, to become knowledgeable in various areas, and that's just not easy. I think that the challenge of interdisciplinarity arises because people recognize that being knowledgeable, being an expert in one field is not enough. But being an expert in many fields nowadays is almost impossible. And so you're caught in between the realization that one field is not enough, or expertise in one field is not enough. And expertise in many fields is just not possible. So it's being between, you know, in a very complicated situation where you need to necessarily rely on collaborators, where you need to develop the concept of doing science as a group, as a community effort, rather than as a single individual. I think that these days, the papers that my PhD students write cannot be single authored paper. Because there's no one person that would be able to do everything, right? And that's certainly challenging. So on the one hand, interdisciplinarity opens up, you know, many questions that are super exciting. On the other hand, getting people to work together is not easy. You have to be able to translate your question to other fields, and you also have to understand what the other fields meant by asking this question or that question recently or down the road. These fields also have a history that you know, must be studied a bit. And so inevitably, I think it's a bit like learning a second language when you're an adult, right? You can be good at it, but you'll never be quite like a native speaker, right? And navigating across fields is a little bit like that. You need to behave like a translator. You need to know several languages. But I think it's important to realize that there's always one language, as it were, and that one field of expertise you will have, and then additions that will imply collaboration. And I think that that's also challenging. So I think one thing that's not often stressed, or maybe not too clear to young linguists or young researchers, is when people hear the notion of interdisciplinarity, it sounds very good. But the work that's truly interdisciplinary is the good work that's truly interdisciplinary is hard, right? And so linguists will have to choose, I think. Say, linguists that started like me as theoretical linguists will have to choose between a field that's far from its best right? The theoretical linguistics field, or a set of fields that's super exciting but super challenging, right? And how young linguists cope with this difficulty will actually determine how well they do in the field, right? And so young linguists should realize that whatever they do, they cannot do it on their own. They'll have to rely on on other experts as well.
Yes, and that's maybe sometimes hard to realize because I think, well, in our country, but I think like everywhere, you are evaluated on your own when you want to get a job, get a scholarship. So maybe it's hard to realize the importance of working with others within your field and within other fields.
Yeah, it's a major challenge in that indeed academia is not super well structured for this type of collaboration, certainly in terms of how it recognizes the works of individuals. You're right that it's still very much based on individual efforts. And we know that these individual efforts are limited, right? There was a time, you know, where people could do works on their own and made a significant contribution to the field. That time is gone pretty much. I think that it's very important for young linguists to realize that that's a thing of the past, right? And the sooner people realize that that's a thing of the past, the sooner they can actually take decisive steps in gathering the set of expertise and friends and colleagues that they will need to approach the questions that they want to address. But on their own, I'm afraid things are too limited.
And well, yes, that's. And do we have time for one more question?
I do, so it's up to
Okay,
you.
great. So the question is, which topics do you consider should be investigated in the following years?
Again, many. I mean, you know, I think I'll mention a couple that are, say, at the forefront of my mind. Right. So it's clear now that we can gain a lot of insights from looking at this thing we call language, or even aspects of it, across a range of different levels of analysis or disciplines, if you want. So I think that now there's this very productive field of say the genetics of language that can that I think is one of my favorite topics. But there's also the field of neuroscience that's very important, neurolinguistics, right? Then there is the cognitive sciences in plural that I think are very important, and maybe then the behavioral sciences, and all these different levels add up details that are important to eventually integrate with one another. And I think that one of the topics that must be addressed is how to provide linking hypotheses between these different levels, how to concretely and substantially connect the results that you can get in one discipline to make it relevant for another, or one level, I should say. So say you have a particular finding that clearly relates to language when you look at, say, a genetic disorder, for example, that impacts on the brain. You study the brain, you have a particular neural circuit that you think is important for a trait of language. And how do you link these? How do you connect the vocabularies of one field to the vocabulary of another field? So when a neuroscientist talks about neurons or brain oscillations? How does this relate to the traditional notions of, a syntactic phrase or a syllable for the phonologist? How do we actually link these concepts across different levels of analysis will certainly be a necessary question to handle in the next 10 years, 20, 30, I don't know years, but certainly it's that. I think that another topic will be what's the progress that one can make when studying the topic of language evolution. So this was a topic that when I was a graduate student, people told me, this is not something you can do. I mean, the topic of language evolution, that's gone. There is no evidence for this. I mean, it's just storytelling. That's not true anymore. I think that the field of language evolution is really thriving. And it is a field that's thriving precisely because it's found ways, very interesting ways, of making the field empirical, of asking questions that can actually be tested in very different ways, but they can be tested. And I think that we need more of this. That is, we need to resist the temptation to offer nice stories about how language may have evolved, to and make way to formulating hypotheses that you can actually test in certain circumstances. So I think that young linguists interested in this field should actually have this mindset that if you're tempted to posit a certain, to make a certain claim about language evolution, before you put it down on paper, be sure that you have a way to test it, right? And I think that this requirement that something be testable, be empirically tangible, is a requirement that will gain prominence in the field. I think we will see less work that you can write, as it were, in your armchair, and more work that you can write after a stay in a lab. And I think that these questions will grow in importance, will grow in number, hopefully. But that's certainly the sort of questions that I feel very excited about for the coming years, right? And maybe as a last point, I think now that the field of linguistics is slowly less dominated by a single individual, I think it might be time to try to integrate these different traditions in linguistics, so we've discussed things about interdisciplinarity, the need to reach to other disciplines, and so on and so forth. All of this is good, but I think it's also important to look within one discipline and realize the richness of linguistics, even before we start talking about other fields, right? And ask, how do we connect this? I think the clearest question to me that really begs for this unification within linguistics is the topic of language acquisition. How do children end up acquiring their native language, for example? I mean, that requires a knowledge about what language is, how different stages of language, and so on and so forth. But it also requires a lot of investigations about the ecology of language, the context in which language is is acquired, the society in which it acquired, how the organism matures independently of language, how the brain matures as well, because eventually that's the brain that's going to acquire that knowledge. And this problem of language acquisition is clearly, an area where all the different aspects of linguistics can actually tell you something important, right? And we have gone through several decades where it looked like a single subdiscipline of linguistics could actually get the answer. Perhaps the clearest case of this is, some of you may know, very early in the minimalist program, I think Chomsky and colleagues said something like, now that we have solved the problem of language acquisition, we can move on to something else, right? Well, that problem of language acquisition has not been solved, right? And cannot be solved by a single discipline. And so how do we actually learn from one another within linguistics to make headway into that particular question that's central to the field is, I think, a fascinating perspective for the future. Hard question, no doubt, but I think an essential one for all of us.
And regarding that last comment on language acquisition, language acquisition has been considered for many years as a door or as a mirror of language evolution. So do you think we're still considering that, or are there like new perspectives regarding language evolution?
I think that yes, the problem of language evolution can be informed by many different questions. Certainly, how the brain grows to acquire a stable language system is important. So in many ways, neurolinguistics tells you something very important about language evolution. The field of language acquisition is absolutely central to that question. So the interplay and the relationship between development and evolution has a very long history in the field of biology, and there is no reason to think that it would be any different for language. So certainly we ought to expect a lot from the field of language acquisition for anyone interested in language evolution. So I think that it's extremely relevant and central. It's not the only approach, right? Like I said, there's also work on other species that are particularly important, but I wish I knew more about language acquisition when I work on language evolution. And I think that a lot of people feel like that. And I think it's not just conceptually related. It's also empirically very relevant, because the thing that evolves is actually a certain developmental path that you can actually study in children right now. So just like in evolution, language acquisition really relies on the temporal dimension, on things happening over a long period of time, relative to the question you asked, but certainly over a certain period of time, different things are happening at different stages, and all of this ordering of stages matter. That's true for language acquisition. That's also true for language evolution. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Boeckx, for all your answers and all your time. I don't know if Victoria wants to add something else, or if you would like to add something else.
I don't have any questions, but I want to thank you for these questions and the time that you made for me to try to answer at least some of them.